You're listening to the My Simplified Life podcast, and this is episode number 286. Welcome to the My Simplified Life podcast, a place where you will learn that your past and even your present don't define your future. Regardless of what stage of life you're in, I want you to feel inspired and encouraged to pursue your dreams, simplify your life, and start taking action. I'm your host, Michelle Glogovac, author of How to Get On Podcasts, the podcast matchmaker, and CEO and founder of the MLG Collective. I'm excited to share the stories and life lessons of changemakers and authors with you while taking you on my own journey. This is My Simplified Life. Hey friends, welcome back to another episode. I'm your host, Michelle Glogovac, and today I am talking to author Jacqueline Friedland, author of Counting Backwards, which is a dual timeline historical fiction book that is way too close to reality because there is so much reality in it, from a Supreme Court case to literally what is happening right now in our country with deportation centers, detention centers, sterilization, women's rights. I absolutely loved this book, from the legal aspect to the fact that these are very important issues and rights that we're discussing right now. So I was so eager to talk to Jackie about her background, about how she was inspired to write this book. And I highly encourage you to read Counting Backwards and to go check out Jackie. Hi, Jacqueline.
Hi, Michelle.
I'm so excited to talk to you. And Jacqueline, but your friends call you Jackie. So I think
It's,
we're friends now, right?
we are definitely friends.
Can you introduce yourself to everyone, please?
Okay, so I am Jackie or Jacqueline Friedland. I am the author of 5 novels, 2 of which are historical fiction and 2 are contemporary fiction. And the one that I am releasing this month is a dual timeline of both history and contemporary fiction called Counting Backwards. And I'm thrilled to be here.
It was an amazing book. I've already read it. I have it here. I was lucky enough to get my hands on it before it's come out. So I loved it. And then I loved reading about you after the fact, because the main character is an attorney. You are an attorney.
I was.
I wanted to be one, I thought, growing up, and that's what my degrees are in. So I found it even more fascinating because of the casework behind it. And then share a little synopsis without giving away the ending or anything like
Sure.
that.
Sure. So the book it's based on a true story that made headlines in 2020, but barely got any coverage, about incarcerated immigrants who were being sterilized without their consent. And this is the story of a lawyer who discovers a situation like this and how her life and the life of the incarcerated women changes as a result of her fight for women's rights. I can go deeper into the story. That's sort of the 2 sentence overview.
Yeah, I felt it was so applicable for what's going on right now too in our country with deportations and detention centers, and we still have a huge incarceration problem. And I was so mesmerized by the fact that you wrote this, not even knowing that we were going to be where we are today as we're talking, and how relevant it truly is. It's
Yeah.
mind-boggling.
Um, what was crazy to me is that when I started writing the story, it was shortly after all of the news had been focusing on families getting separated at the border, and there was all that news about like children being kept in cages and people saying no, yes, whatever. And I thought, yes, this is a hot button issue right now. But by the time I finish this book and by the time it goes through the publication process, it'll just be like another theme of a topic that matters, but it won't be quite this, prevalent as in the news. And little did I know it's, more topical than ever right now. So
And the book, it goes back even further, with the dual timeline and comparing it to literally, it's going to be relevant apparently for many years to come because this has been going on for decades. And it's so scary and it's sad and disturbing. And it amazes me that all of these things, even what we see going on today, continue to go on, and there's nobody putting a stop to it, or those who are trying to fight against it aren't having any luck in doing so.
Yes. Well, one thing that was crazy to me is so the dual timeline portion of this story is that it focuses on a Supreme Court case from 1927 where a real case where a young woman named Carrie Buck, who was 17 years old, was institutionalized primarily. The later writings show because she was unwed and pregnant, and she was uneducated and a foster kid, and that was just they didn't want to deal with her, and they put her into this institution, but she was designated as what they called at the time feeble-minded. And the court was, it was during this time period in American history, dark time period, where eugenics was kind of becoming the latest craze. And the court decided, based on the evidence, that if they were to sterilize her, it could prevent this young woman from having more offspring that might also be feeble-minded, as they say. Unfortunately for Carrie, later studies show that she was actually of completely average intelligence, and that she was just a poor girl in a bad situation. And they used her as a test case because her mother was also institutionalized, and she had actually had this one infant out of wedlock, and they could very easily classify the baby at, with any diagnosis they wanted to, because it's an infant and who would know. So what was really interesting to me, though, is that as I was reading about Carrie and her life, the foster family who committed her, that she lived with for most of her childhood, was the Dobbs family. And I actually kept that name in the book because of the Dobbs Supreme Court case, the recent case that overruled Roe versus Wade. And it was just this like weird, eerie coincidence that I was like, how could that even be true? But it was. So, it's obviously mine is the fictionalized version of all this, but I was like, we've got to keep the name Dobbs.
Yeah, it was too realistic. There's a true part to the whole story, and yet I really felt like the entire thing was true because we're seeing it go on today, and it's so disturbing. And I'm so glad that you've written this book and that you bring to light so much that I think people aren't aware of, didn't know happened, continues to happen, and we don't even know what the future is going to bring, because I don't know. I think it could get worse if that's even possible.
Let's hope not.
I
I
hope
think
every day.
important for people to understand also that regardless of where you stand on the abortion question, that's not even the point of this book at all. It's
Yeah.
really about how reproductive rights are about so much more than the right to terminate a pregnancy. They're about the right to have a pregnancy. And I think that I just hope that people will read the book and feel almost like galvanized to learn more and want to do more to make sure that people can have these sort of inalienable rights to reproduce.
Yeah. And to stand up for, those who don't have the voice or who are so scared because these rights are taken away, to go to a detention center and they're making this decision for you. And if you say something, then they're just going to deport you. And we're seeing, I know that here in San Jose, we had somebody who he was just arrested by ICE, and I still don't understand why. And they just shipped him off to a detention center. He's been here for years. He's married to an American, but that these things are literally happening right now, male or female, which is just so mind boggling.
Yes. I actually just saw a statistic. I don't know if it's still valid, but for about a week and a half ago or 2 weeks ago, that all of the ICE detention facilities in the US were at 106% capacity. So yeah, I agree. Like there is definitely a lot of importance in focusing in what's going on inside those detention centers, because whether the people belong in the US or not, we have an obligation as humans to make sure that they are receiving humane treatment until they get wherever it is they will be going next.
Yes, and I feel like there's also so many you tackle so many issues in this book. It's so incredible because you also talk about like the insurance scam the privatization of these prisons. And these are all still very realistic things.
Yes. That was actually news to me. I did not know before I started writing this book and doing all the research that so many immigration detention centers and also just, U.S. prisons are managed by private companies. I just assumed it was, the government, but the government contracts it out to people who have some, infrastructure to do this. And that impacts, what happens inside also.
What inspired you to take on this book, write this novel, and to tackle all of these incredible issues?
So it goes all the way back to when I was in high school. I was a senior in high school, and my history teacher gave us each the assignment to pick a Supreme Court case between 1900 and 1945, and we were going to be sort of wedded to the case for the semester, and we were going to write a long research paper and do all this stuff. And I found the case of Buck versus Bell, and I was floored. All these Supreme Court opinions are usually they're long, they're dense, they're boring. The opinion in Buck versus Bell is like 3 paragraphs, super short. And it's riveting to see, horribly riveting, but it's riveting to see these justices. The case was written by Oliver Wendell Holmes, who was considered this great humanitarian. And he, at some point in the opinion, writes, 3 generations of imbeciles is enough. And he compares compulsory sterilization to getting vaccinated. And I think they thought they were doing a service to society. But it really, at the time, being a 17-year-old myself at that time, reading about what had happened to this 17-year-old girl, it really it made quite an impact on me, and it stuck with me for a very long time. And when I began writing historical fiction, I actually thought about writing Carrie's story, and it didn't feel right. And then in 2020, I was reading this news story, and the headline said "The Uterus Collector," and I'm like, what is this? And I read a story about a detention center down south where there was a nurse who was a whistleblower who said there was a doctor sterilizing the inmates and not telling them that he was like saying they needed different kinds of procedures, and they would get their anesthesia. And when they woke up, he would tell them, "Oh, you also had a cyst or this or that. And I had to remove your uterus, or I had to cut your fallopian tube or whatever, or I took an ovary." And so there's actually still a federal lawsuit pending in court, a class action regarding this. And so these allegations are not proven. And, my book is a fictionalized version of my imaginings of what this may have been like for people. But when I saw that news story, of course, my mind immediately went back to Carrie Buck. And, it was like 100 years later, and the same thing is still happening. And I just, that moment, I knew, like, it was like, you get that tingle on the back of your neck, like, this is the book I need to write. I need to spread awareness about what could be going on in the US. And that was the inspiration.
It's fascinating that you say this is my imagination of what would happen, and yet it's so realistic that I don't believe it was far-fetched at all. I was like, "Yeah, this is totally realistic in my opinion." And that's the scary part.
That is the scary part.
How did you go from attorney at NYU to getting your MFA to writing 5 novels? Where did that little detour go?
So you said earlier that you had wanted to be an attorney, and
Yeah.
you're not one. I was the opposite. I never wanted to be an attorney. And when I was in college and I was kind of getting near the end of college and didn't know what I wanted to do with myself yet, I would have loved to have been a writer right off the bat, but it just felt like it didn't feel like a realistic, responsible choice. So I told my favorite English professor that I wanted to get a PhD in English. And he talked me out of it and told me how the profession has changed, and it's a lot less teaching than it used to be, and a lot more fighting for tenure, and a lot more struggling to get your articles published. And he was like nearing retirement and was sort of nostalgic about the good old days. And he talked me out of it. And so I spoke to my parents, who told me, go to law school. And, if you don't like it, at least you'll have this great legal education and you can figure out something afterwards. And my rationale was that if I went to law school and became a lawyer and hated it, I would always fall back on my love of literature and English and words and stories. But if I did it the other way around, I would never go to law school, several years out of college because I just wasn't that interested in it. But it turned out that I actually really liked law school. I have an inner nerd. I love school and I love studying and, the
Same.
school supplies. And I just didn't like being a lawyer at all from the minute I stepped into a big firm in New York City. And, I find the legal issues really interesting, but the actual practical, like practice of law, down to like the little things of putting you need to put these blue backs, at least you did when I was working there, on the back of the documents that are getting submitted to the court, and they have to be just so, and, like just these little things that I just didn't care about at all. And so at some point, I decided that I was going to write a book on the side. And if I could get it published, then I could quit. I could escape being a lawyer. And I started writing, but during that time I also started having my children, and I ended up having 4 kids in 6.5 years, so I was moving slowly on the writing. And when I got pregnant with my fourth child, my sister, who's also an attorney, said, you're never going to be able to have all these little kids and be the kind of mom that I know you want to be, and the kind of lawyer that I would want to be. And, if this is the time, if you're going to make a move. So that was when I decided. I applied to go get my MFA. And that was when I went back to school. And I ended up publishing my first book when my youngest child started kindergarten. So, or actually selling it. It came out a couple of years later, but getting the deal to publish it.
So you got your MFA while you had 4 kids under
Yes.
7.
Started. I mean, yeah.
Mine are a year and 3 weeks apart. I only have 2 because
Uh-huh.
that was enough. We were like, oh, that's close. We're good. So I totally get it. And then I actually did go to law school while the first one, I started before the first one was born. And then I ended up just getting my master's in law because I went, yeah, I'm not going to go be a lawyer, but now I've got so much schooling behind me. I might as well graduate with some sort of a degree.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I find the law so fascinating too. I love reading cases and stories, which is probably why I loved the book so much of, where do we go down this path and, get in the courtroom and all of that. And I love that Jessa, the main character, she's this attorney who is really good at what she does. And she makes a mistake along the way, which it broke my heart. I'm like, oh, come on. Like, she can't make partner because of this one mistake she made, and they're holding it to her. And we won't give it all away, but yet, like, she eventually figures out what she loves to do and does it and is amazing at it. But I mean, that's another whole part of your book of like, why can't this woman get ahead?
Well, I have to say, when I left the law, I was like totally jaded. I hated it so much. I just felt so smothered by just being in the office. And when I left, I said, when I write books, I'm not gonna do like a whole John Grisham thing, and I'm not gonna write anything about the law. And so, like, the first book, nothing. It was historical fiction, like totally antebellum South, like nothing about lawyers. The second book, I made my main character a lawyer who hated her job, and like, but that was it. You didn't really hear about her job. And then, by the third book, there was a custody battle and a novel legal issue that's never been covered. In the fourth and fifth, it's like the law is really central to both of those books, and I'm like going through the case, and but it turns out I do find the law interesting. So it's actually kind of a pleasure to research these issues and understand them and be able to put them into a story where you see them in a new way.
I love that. And there's a little love story in there too. I we're not giving anything away, but I will say I loved how it ended.
Yeah. Thank you. So I am a big reader of romance. I say, if you've seen Legally Blonde, I always say I identify deeply with Elle Woods
Mhm.
because I think my personality is sort of like, I seem frivolous and I want to talk about, hair and makeup and read romance novels and rom-coms, and but I actually have all these other thoughts in the back of my head that are more intellectual and scholarly, and again, inner nerd. But one thing that's been very nice for me is that I try, when I'm reading books, it's like I can totally separate from my work, because my work is very different from romance novels. But I also am a sucker for romance, so I always try to put just a hint of something that's gonna, you know, just to make it a little bit fun.
I love it. I feel like we could be good friends because I'm like, yeah, give me reality TV and let me dumb it down a little bit. But
Yep.
at the same time, I'm like, oh, a court case. Let me read about that. I
Yeah,
would love to hear more. What can I advocate for in
yeah,
this?
exactly.
It's a good balance between the two.
I agree. I agree.
So what's your next one coming? Are you working on another one, of
I
course?
am working on another book that will hopefully come out late in 2026. And it's the story. It's still, the plot is still evolving, but it's roughly the story of a college athlete, a young woman who crumbles under the weight of all of the pressure and obligations being put on her. And she finds sort of salvation, redemption in a relationship with an autistic teenager that, ends up helping both of them.
Oh, is there going to be a legal aspect to it?
Unclear.
It feels like there has to be somehow now.
There may be something going on. That's one of the sticky plot points I'm still working out.
Oh, I love. Well, I'm sure there's enough for you to work with in all, in all of it. I love it. Has what has been as this book has come out, as the state of our country is in chaos, like what has that been like for you as you've been bringing this book, out to the public? What have been the reactions, or how has this affected you too, to go, oh, this is happening now? I've got this book out that I thought was kind of more imaginary. It's not so much. And what have people said to you? Like, it hasn't been eye opening for them.
There's definitely been that's sort of like a theme, I think, of what people are saying is, oh my goodness, I didn't know, I can't believe it. And yes, eye opening. And also how topical it is, how it feels like, it couldn't be more timely, a lot of people have been saying, which I would agree with. I have also started being asked some like serious questions about immigration and policy and like all of that kind of stuff, which I have said, like, I finally responded in a way that I felt comfortable with in a magazine interview the other day, and said, I'm not well versed enough in the policies to take a position. And I'm also not telling people what to think. What I am doing is saying, here is the situation, make up your own mind. And I'm just sharing information of like what's out there or could be out there.
Yeah,
So
to build awareness.
exactly.
And it's so important because I think there's so much that we don't talk about. And that I think that's part of the reason of why we're where we are right now, is that we aren't having these conversations. We aren't bringing to light what is happening literally in our backyards, not literally, but literally. And it's so important because, like you said, we're all human beings, and that should be the most important thing.
Yes.
We're women who like to read. So read the book and educate yourself, and now be aware, and then do something about it. Speak about it.
Well, one thing that's crazy, I have realized the biggest trend in my books is that when I see something, and I ask myself, how do people not know about this? That's sort of the thing that becomes my book. And one of the things that I found very eye opening about counting backwards, doing the research for it, is that our country has a history of sterilizing women. And like, so it's not just the two timelines I was writing about, but everything in between. There have been thousands and thousands of involuntary sterilizations, many where the women didn't even know this was happening to them. And so that part is where sort of my focus goes. I find that I'm very, very interested in reproduction. Like my books and my stories kind of always end up leaning that way. So that was sort of just kind of also a big motivation behind me writing this book of how do people not know about this?
Well, and then the history of how it was happening in the United States first, and those ideas were sent over to Germany,
Yes.
and they didn't come up with this on their own. We gave it to them.
Exactly. And it came from all our greatest philanthropists like Vanderbilt and Rockefeller. And, it's unfortunate. Like they thought they were doing a good thing here in the US, and also they were the lab where the biggest eugenics hub at the time in the 20s was the Cold Spring Harbor lab on Long Island in New York. I grew up in Syosset, right on the edge between Syosset and Cold Spring Harbor. This lab was like basically in my backyard. And I didn't grow up in the 20s, but it just the fact that lab is still there. And the I also find eugenics sort of fascinating because you can talk about, like, on some level it almost sounds like a good idea when you start thinking about it, like, oh, we could breed out disease and we could breed out blindness, but like maybe the people in the blind community wouldn't necessarily think that's a good thing. And then how far do you go? Do you breed out baldness? Do or like at which
Yeah.
point do you draw the line? And then it starts to get into the really dark territory of breeding out, people you don't like. But it's just sort of interesting to consider and play with ideas in your head of how people could have started out thinking they were helping people, and then how wrong of a turn the whole thing could take.
Yeah, and then with, mutations and DNA and, we know so much more now. You would think that we would know so much more now that it would make us smarter, and yet it's still happening. So I don't know how far advanced we've become,
Yep.
because in a lot of ways it feels like we've gone backwards and we're still in the 1920s sometimes.
Yes, I would agree with that.
What do you hope comes out of this book? What's your hope?
So I have the same hope with every book that I write, which is, my mom was a professor of special ed. She's recently retired. And I always thought when I grew up, I was going to have a job like my mom and do, like, every day where I went to work, I'd be doing some sort of good in the world. And then I became a writer. Well, first I was a lawyer where felt like I was doing the opposite of good in the world. And then I became a writer, and I thought I was just convincing myself of another fiction, but I actually believe this. I think that writers, when you write these human stories, you're increasing the empathy out in the world, and you're hopefully turning your readers into more kind, more aware, more involved people. And so that is my hope for this book out in the world, that I have done my little piece of goodness for the world by sharing this and getting people to think and be kind and act.
I couldn't love this more. I fully agree. I think what you have set out to do, you have absolutely accomplished. Yes,
That's nice.
especially in this book. I need to go back and read your other books too, because this is the first one I read, and I was like, yes, yes, please. Okay, now I need to connect with Jackie. I love it. And I totally agree. I think that reading and then talking about it is what's going to build the empathy that we need so much more of. So I'm so glad you wrote this book. And I hope that literally everyone in America needs to read it. And then overseas too. That would be great.
I like that.
But
Yes,
yeah.
everyone in America.
Yes, especially every woman. Let's start with every woman, and then you can leave it on your husband's nightstand and
Yep.
let him read it too. But I really think that it's going to open a lot of eyes and hopefully minds that, more needs to be done. Now is not the time to sit down and look the other way, but speak up and acknowledge that this is happening still. So thank you for writing this.
Thank you for reading it and for having me on to talk about it.
My pleasure. Where can everyone find you and pick up Counting Backwards?
So they can find me on my website, JacquelineFriedland.com, or on Instagram at Jackie Friedland. And my book is available wherever books are sold,
Uh,
online, in store. It will be coming out March 11th, but you can pre-order now.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
I really hope that our conversation and Jackie's book, Counting Backwards, encourages you to look at these issues that are prevalent today, that have been for over a century, and to speak up. Share your thoughts on what is going on what you see, what you hear, and what's literally right in front of us. Because as Jackie said, we're all human beings, and that really needs to be what is the most important thing when we look at the prison system, mass deportations. How are we treating people? Please go read Counting Backwards, connect with Jackie. Let me know what you thought of the book and this episode, and don't be afraid to speak up because you can't be silenced, and I support you.